pleasure to introduce our first speaker, somebody I know personally really well. I was just trying to figure out, at least 15 years we've been cross-referring patients. Pulmonologist Vivek Jain, MD, is a leader in sleep medicine research, associate professor of medicine here at the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine at GW. He's also serves as a director of the GW Center for Sleep Disorders, a position he has held since 2009. So Dr. Jain has been on campus for a long time. Dr. Jain obtained his medical degree from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, India, and he did his internship at the Rush University Medical Center. He did his residency in internal medicine and fellowship in pulmonary and critical care medicine at the University of Missouri Hospital Clinic in Columbia, Missouri. Dr. Jain's research on various aspects of sleep disorders have been published in more than 50 peer-reviewed scholarly journals and numerous books. I do personally want to highlight that had a whole chapter on the effects of music on sleep. I find that totally fascinating, and it tells you a breadth of our colleagues. They're not just looking at the sleep from, more purely medical perspective, but as you hear from speakers, this is a lot broader, more holistic way of thinking and looking at it. He's been named one of the Washington top doctor 6 times since 2012. And as I mentioned, we shared multiple patients together. Dr. Jain has been training physicians and PA students and interns and residents and fellows for nearly 2 decades. And so with that, I'll pass it on to him to present to us the sleep to support whole person well-being. Thank you, Dr. Jain, for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Misha, and thank you, Dr. Frame and Dr. Bass. Let me share my screen here. I hope everybody can see that. Good. Well, thank you again for the organizers for this. Obviously I'm biased towards sleep, so a well thought of symposium and a good topic for this symposium on sleep. Let me see if I can advance the slides. I'm going to start with this Irish proverb: a good laugh and long sleep are the best cure in a doctor's book. Unfortunately, poor sleep health in the United States is an epidemic. If you look at the numbers, and these are outdated probably, these are probably a decade old, and things have probably gotten worse since then. But 50 to 70 million Americans complain of being or suffering from some form of a sleep disorder. And if you just look at the numbers on sleep deprivation, if the optimal amount of sleep that we need is 7 to 8 hours, 1 out of every 3 American complains of having less than 7 hours of sleep. Not complains of it, that's what they get. They get used to it, but obviously we'll talk about how it has an effect on our overall health. 10 to 15%, probably again a very small or underestimated number that comes to the clinic complaining of a sleep disorder. Shift work, it's a separate topic, and I'm sure one of our speakers who on circadian rhythms will perhaps touch on this topic. But 20%, if perhaps not more, of our workforce is doing some form of shift work, which it can have an effect on the quality of sleep. If you look at these numbers from the NHANES data here in the lower right bottom, you can see clearly that number of people complaining of having less than 7 hours of sleep is, probably in the range of 25 to 35%. And then when we see people in the sleep clinic, and this is what we train our fellows and residents to recognize, that people will not just have 1 sleep complaint or 2 sleep complaints. Even 10 to 15% of the patients coming to the clinic will have more than 3 separate sleep disorders that they'll be complaining of. So, we can't just say it's sleep apnea or sleep deprivation or insomnia. They may have all these things in combination. Now, poor sleep health can be due to many, many different reasons, but I'm just going to try and focus on insufficient amount of sleep. That is probably the most common reason for why people feel sleepy and tired in the United States. And it's probably most under-recognized, even in clinics. And throughout most of my talk, I'll be talking about the effect of sleep deprivation on our health. There will be a speaker later on today who will be talking about how timing of sleep and its dysynchrony with our requirement or our physiology can cause sleep disorders, circadian misalignment. And then obviously there's a whole plethora of different kinds of sleep disorders that can cause poor quality sleep or poor sleep health. We'll have a talk on sleep apnea. We won't be touching on narcolepsy, restless legs, or insomnia. The latest ICSD classification on sleep disorders talks about 105 different sleep disorders, and obviously we won't have time to touch on all those. We all familiar with the consequences of poor sleep health. We look at these as items in a newspaper or on the websites, and then we just ignore them and we say, hey, let's carry on. But all of these have been linked in one way or the other to either sleep deprivation or sleep apnea or some form of sleep disorder. So my objective today would be to talk about what is normal sleep, what is the normal sleep duration that we should aim for, what have you learned over the years about what is the function of sleep? I mean, sleep is ubiquitous. I mean, every living being has what we call as a sleep rest or rest activity cycle. And what have you learned over the last 30, 40 years about what is the actual basic function of sleep? And what are the causes and consequences of poor sleep health? All of us, I'm sure, know about this, at least in this audience, that sleep is two types: non-REM, which is non-rapid eye movement sleep, and the rapid eye movement sleep. And we've recognized over the years that the non-rapid eye movement sleep can be further divided into what we call as non-REM 1, 2, and 3. Non-REM 1 may or may not even exist in a given person. Most of our sleep is NR2 or light sleep, and then we have something called the deep sleep or NR3 sleep. There used to be a fourth stage 4 sleep or NR4 sleep that we've stopped using in classification of sleep because it's difficult to score NR3 versus NR4. The first sleep that was recognized before we had EEGs and fancy electrodes and stuff like that was the rapid eye movement sleep, because it was so obvious to people looking at, just when you look at somebody sleeping, they'll have these phases where they'll move their eyes rapidly. In our sleep labs, when we recognize these different stages of sleep, we base it on basically how the EEG looks, in addition to other things that are happening, including eye movements and what is happening to the muscle tone. Here you can see that deep sleep has these big EEG waves, which are slow and tombstone looking with high amplitude. So that's the definition of really deep sleep. What's also fascinating to us is that when you look at these EEG during REM sleep here at the bottom, and we compare that to what maybe light sleep or even wakefulness, they look very similar to each other. And that's why sometimes REM sleep is also known as paradoxical sleep, because from an EEG perspective, it looks very similar to what awake looks or even light sleep looks, but obviously the person is sleeping. Not only do we have these different stages of sleep, but throughout a given night, we go through these stages in a kind of a well-defined manner. And we call that a hypnogram, so just a tracing of the different stages of sleep throughout the night. So here on the x-axis, you have the hours of sleep as you start from, going to sleep and then throughout the night. And most of us will go into sleep by starting into either stage 1 or stage 2. And then we go into our deeper stages of sleep. Then we come out of those deeper stages of sleep to go into a light stage of sleep before we go into our first REM sleep. And REM sleep is usually, and by convention, represented by these bars. And what you can see is that in any given night for a normal individual, the first half of the night is where we have predominantly deep sleep and slow wave sleep. And for years and years and years, we used to call that the requisite sleep. So if I can sleep the first 4 to 5 hours, we'll call that the requisite sleep, because we get most of our deep sleep at that time. And pre-industrialized societies could even have the concept of something called 2 sleeps, that we would sleep 4 or 5 hours, wake up, and then go back to sleep again. Second half of the sleep is where we have most of our REM sleep. So we have these sleep cycles that cycle every 60 to 90 minutes. But during the first few stages or cycles of this sleep, we'll have most of our deep sleep. And towards the end, we may actually stop having any deep sleep at all, but we have most of our REM sleep towards the end. Now, one thing, before I go into what are the different, is there any difference between REM and non-REM, but in terms of function, but most of our sleep, like I said, is going to be stage 2 sleep. And the way I remember it, and I teach it, is that half the sleep is stage 2 sleep or light sleep, and the other half is equally divided between deep sleep and REM sleep. So 25% of deep sleep and REM sleep, and 50% is stage 2 sleep. In spite of years and years and years of research, when we talk about sleep deprivation, it's rare to talk about just non-REM deprivation or REM deprivation, because it's not known yet what are the actual functions of each stage of sleep. Because even in normal people, there could be complete absence of slow wave sleep or deep sleep, and they're functional people. Uh, some studies have shown that by the time we are 20 years of age, maybe 5 or 8% of us will have no deep sleep, but these are normally functioning people. Same thing with REM sleep. Things like antidepressant use completely eliminates REM sleep. And yet there's absolutely no negative effect of the absence of REM sleep. Um, Certain disorders like depression have a lot of REM sleep. We don't understand why. You know, so again, when we talk about in my rest of the slides about sleep deprivation, rarely do we talk about like non-REM versus REM deprivation. We talk about total sleep deprivation. We do know that our sleep changes in quality as we age. Um, so as in a young adult, we'll have this beautiful, nice looking hypnogram where we go through these kind of stages of sleep that we described. But if I was to do a hypnogram in somebody who's 70, 75 or plus years of age, this is quite typical that we'll see a lot of what we call a sleep fragmentation. We'll see less amount of deep sleep. We'll see even the REM sleep, though it happens every 60 to 90 minutes, each episode has less REM sleep. Uh, and there's lots of awakenings throughout the night. And these are normal, otherwise healthy elderly people. And yet they have this abnormal sleep architecture without, a significant consequence. Now, certainly as we get older, is it a neurological reason why we have this kind of sleep disruption or abnormal sleep architecture? Is it due to comorbid conditions? Is it due to medications? And that's something that can be argued. So in general, what we see with aging is that the amount of time it takes to fall asleep does not change. The amount of REM sleep doesn't change significantly until really late in life. What changes very quickly by the time we are 20, 30, 40 years of age is that the amount of deep sleep starts decreasing. What also changes very rapidly is that the number of awakenings of what we call as wake after sleep onset increases as we get older. So we have more of these awakenings throughout the night. Obviously, the amount of light sleep remains pretty constant as we age. The other thing that I want to introduce as a kind of a general concept of physiology of sleep is what controls sleep. Why do we sleep? When do we sleep? How much do we sleep? Is governed by basically two processes, and we call that the homeostatic process, or the process S, and the circadian process, or process C. And as you can see here on this graph, is that so here you are, this is the homeostatic sleep drive. And as we start our day, we get up in the morning, and as we continue throughout the day, the homeostatic drive to sleep increases. So we have this pressure to sleep increase as we go through our day, and that's why it allows us to sleep when the night comes. But on the other hand, to counteract that drive to sleep throughout the day, we have a circadian drive that allows us to remain awake. And so that increases. So the circadian drive is a wakefulness drive, and that is increasing throughout the day. Let me see where my arrow is right here. So you can see this go up. So it counteracts that pressure that I'm building to sleep. Now, is somewhere in the afternoons, right about now, in most of us, we'll see that there's going to be a brief moment in time where the circadian wakefulness drive will be slightly less than the homeostatic sleep drive. So we have this, what we call as an afternoon dip. And so it's normal for us to feel a little drowsy and sleepy sometime between 12 noon and 4 p.m. But unfortunately, as societies, we've decided not to encourage taking naps, though I think in sleep societies, that concept is changing, where we are telling our patients and our colleagues to not be shy about taking a 15, 20-minute nap in the afternoon, because that has been shown to increase productivity and also actually have a cardioprotective effect. So that could be a whole separate topic, and like to nap or not to nap. But I think physiologically, we all have a tendency to nap. So if any of you is falling asleep at this time during the seminar, it's not because of the boringness of the topic, but it's a normal circadian dip that's happening in the afternoon between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. So people, again, sleep, as I said, is a conserved phenomenon. Evolutionary. Every living species, plants, animals, have what we call as a rest activity cycle. And so the question to scientists has been, what is the function of sleep? Again, these are uh, based on some scientific data. But again, it's still, the full function of sleep may not be completely still apparent. But in general, sleep, there are neurons which are active during sleep. So it's not like a totally passive state that our brain is just completely not having any neuronal activity. But the areas of the brain that are active during sleep are the ones that are conserving energy in general. And the ones that are active during wakefulness are the ones that are spending that energy. So it's more like during sleep, we conserve our energy. So, things that are going to be active during sleep are going to be things that are, like things like growth hormone or prolactin or luteinizing hormone, testosterone, things that are allowing us to hold on to energy, as opposed to things during the daytime, things like norepinephrine, which is going to be highly, the wake promoting neurons are going to be active during wakefulness, things that are required for things like vigilance, food seeking, seeking a partner, foraging, or things that are required for temperature regulation. So during, wakefulness, we know that the body temperature is higher as opposed to during sleep when the body temperature falls. Um, things like immune function, and we'll talk about that. That is, sleep is very important to restore immune function and immunity for the body. Reorganization of the neural network, something called synaptic pruning. Repair work that goes on inside the body for things that have been damaged, oxidized during the day at the cell level. And so we need, different phases in our 24-hour period where we can do certain things in different compartments and silos. Um, Here's an experiment that was done looking at sleep deprivation experiment, not in humans. This is in rodents. We don't do these kind of experiments in humans where we sleep deprive an individual for up to 6 days continuously, total sleep deprivation. And as you can see in this animal model, because I'm not sleeping, I'm obviously spending energy without conserving energy. So I will lose body mass, as you can see over here. And then, in spite of the fact that when I'm awake, I'm going to be eating a lot. So these mice are constantly eating and yet losing weight because energy balance has changed because of lack of sleep. But after about 6 nights or 6 days, 24-hour periods of continuous sleep deprivation, they will start once again gaining weight, even though their food intake really goes down. So it's the opposite. They just give up. And then, usually after about 2 weeks, these mice of complete sleep deprivation, they die. So we don't do these experiments in humans. We will have a talk about this later on with Dr. Hablitz talking about, is sleep important for something called metabolite clearance? So our neuronal activity is going on during the day, we are accumulating toxins in the brain. And so we need some time in a 24-hour period to clear those toxins from the brain and the CSF. And so this is experiments done again in rodents, looking at the clearance of beta amyloid protein, as you can see in these orange triangles where the rodent is kept awake, as opposed to in sleep conditions or conditions under anesthesia. The clearance of the beta amyloid from the brain is much more during sleep than during wakefulness. Um, and same thing, we can inject something called a carbon label inulin into the frontal cortex of these rodents, and we can see that the clearance of that metabolite is going to be faster during sleep. And so, Dr. Hablitz will be talking more about why this clearance of these toxins and beta amyloids is important, because if these things accumulate in the brain, they are part of the reason why we develop things like neurodegenerative diseases and dementia and things like that. And there's a whole, whole literature looking at causes of or links between sleep issues and cognitive issues, including, risks for dementia. Here in humans, people have also looked at, changes in sleep efficiency here on the right side, where I'm again finding my arrow here. So if my sleep efficiency decreases, that means I'm experimentally disrupting the sleep of these young volunteers. So these are people who are otherwise healthy, and I'm just experimenting on them by disrupting the sleep. I can see that something called tau, which is another bad protein in the brain, will accumulate with worsening sleep efficiency. Again, tau is a bad thing to accumulate in the brain, causing neurodegenerative changes. One thing that's obviously been studied now for 20 years is the association between good sleep and memory consolidation. And the memory consolidation that's been looked at could be a declarative memory, could be procedural memory, could be emotional memory. And it is well now recognized that sleep will strengthen the memory both quantitatively and qualitatively. That means during sleep, and I'll show you some examples, that we actually enhance or strengthen associations of that memory with other experiences that we've had in our life, and therefore we are in a better position to make conclusions and inferences, especially during recall. So what happens if we have an experience during wakefulness, such as listening to this talk? We do recognize here in blue is the hippocampus in this cartoon, and then there are projections that go to the neocortex. So most of our experiences are first going to be, experienced or kind of having a synaptic connection at the level of the hippocampus, and from there those experiences are relayed through a neuronal network to the neocortex. Now, when we go to sleep here on the right-hand side, even though we are not actively engaging the hippocampus anymore because the experience happened during the daytime, but the neocortex is replaying those experiences and both making new synapses, pruning some of the synapses, causing more associations based on the experience that we had during the daytime. So sleep is actively reprocessing things that happened during the daytime. Now, this is again an experiment done in mice where you can see that how the you do measurement of neural activity, say at the level of the cortex or the hippocampus, and you can see that when the mouse was running and I was able to measure the signal coming in from the cortex and the hippocampus, there are certain activations going on during the time when the animal is running in both in the hippocampus and the neocortex. But when the animal goes to sleep, you can see some of this replay still happening, both in the hippocampus and the neocortex. So that means the brain is still kind of reprocessing some of that information that was acquired during wakefulness. Similar things in humans, and so this is what we call as a computer-based model where the subject is going to recognize, what we call as object recognition task. So they have to know, which of these cards is going to be a tree, say for example, or a flower or something like that. And while the human is doing this task, they're also being exposed to a certain odor. Okay. Now, the human has stopped doing this task, and I want to retest how they recall where those certain objects were the next day after they've slept. And I expose them to the odor while they were sleeping to see if that has an effect on their memory or the ability to recall that task. So this is what this experiment is doing. And the fascinating thing is that while the subject is sleeping, I expose them to the odor while they're in slow wave sleep or deep sleep, the recall is much more the next day. If I expose the individual to an odor during the time when they were in REM sleep, the recall is much less. If I expose them to the odor the next day during wakefulness, or they were not allowed to sleep throughout the night but were exposed to the odor, obviously the recall is much less. So there is this kind of a, activity in the brain that is happening during night, which is causing associations, and perhaps the task recognition was associated with the odor, but was enhanced during slow wave sleep. What has also been shown is, so hippocampus is important for memory processing or memory consolidation or memory recognition. or memory recall. And so people have looked at effects of sleep deprivation on just hippocampal volume, and the hypothesis is that if the hippocampus is being affected, then our ability to remember things is going to be less. So here's data from children who were sleep deprived and looked at the hippocampal volume, and you can see that the more sleep deprived the child is, the lower is the hippocampal volume after a follow-up period of 5 to 7 years, roughly. Similar data is coming from insomnia studies, which we are not talking about today, which itself is a separate sleep issue. But one can see that both, here's the data from both the right hippocampal volume and the left hippocampal volume. And this is the duration of insomnia in years on the x-axis. So the longer I have had insomnia, I'm more likely to have a loss of hippocampal neurons. Again, suggesting that perhaps poor sleep health will affect memory. And it does, same thing with something called the arousal index. So arousal is just like a polysomnographic measurement of how my sleep continuity is. So more arousals in the brain is a kind of a sign of loss of sleep continuity. So more arousals there are, lower is the hippocampal volume. And so idea is that poor sleep health can cause memory problems, perhaps because of the loss of hippocampal volume. So just a kind of a cartoon to summarize this in a human, that during wakefulness we have sensory input coming in through through different organs. So there's an event, there's a context, we encode that. Initial storage of that event takes place on the hippocampus. During the night, we consolidate that memory by replaying it in the neocortex. And then if we need to, many years down the road, recall that event and form of an association, we have that capability because that memory has been formed. What I wanted to show you with this schemata is that we have a similar thing that exists in our immune system, where when our immune system similarly has a capability of remembering. So that's why when I'm exposed to a certain foreign body or an antigen, and the antigen processing cell or the lymphoid tissue creates and like an antibody or a T cell that to fight that antigen of the foreign body. So it does that immediate response. It recognizes an event, which in this case is the antigen, but then it creates a storage of that memory of that bad antigen for years down the road. So when I'm re-exposed to that antigen, I will be able to mount my defenses again. So that's what is acquired immunity, is essentially that I can recall that event many months, years down the road and respond to it. And that's, purpose of vaccines. So one of the interesting things that we've recognized in sleep and immunity is that if I was to take an individual who is, who's been given a flu vaccine or a hepatitis vaccine or a COVID vaccine, and I allow that individual to sleep, my antibody response to that vaccine is going to be much more robust as opposed to an individual who's had insufficient sleep on the night after the injection of the vaccine. And that is why, at least, I tell all the patients that if you're going to get a flu shot this season, or, please make sure that you get enough sleep after getting that vaccine, because that will help you mount a much more robust antibody response to the vaccination. And this kind of a paradigm has been reproduced in many other scenarios, where it could be a sleep restriction paradigm, it could be an insomnia paradigm, it could be shift work, where we've recognized whether it's an influenza vaccine or hepatitis A vaccine, B vaccine, meningitis vaccine, the response is much worse if I have poor sleep health. Now, the only study that I came across that was done in people with looking at COVID vaccine is if they had underlying sleep apnea. The study was just specifically looking and seeing if I have a good antibody response or not, and they did not find any change whether I had sleep apnea or I did not have any sleep apnea. But they did not do the study specifically for insomnia, shift work, or sleep deprivation. In general, as a summary, if I'm sleep deprived, I do bad things. I have an uptick of things like the inflammatory mediators. So sleep deprivation changes my balance more towards inflammation as opposed to anti-inflammation. So inflammation is bad for the body. A lot of the inflammatory markers go up, which then can lead to things like cardiovascular disease, infection risk, neurodegeneration. My ability to produce antibodies goes down. My ability to present the antigen to the antigen presenting cell goes down if I'm sleep deprived. My innate immunity, which is dependent on natural killer cells and something called the Th1, Th2 response is going to be affected if I'm sleep deprived. So sleep is good for immunity as well, besides memory, besides energy conservation. Now, what is normal sleep duration? So again, a separate, you know, area of research that's been conducted over the years, looking at the amount of sleep that we need at different stages of our life. Most newborn babies need about 12 to 15 hours of sleep. As we get older and become teenagers, adolescent years, we require maybe 9 to 10 hours. Adults require 6 to 8 hours, which is well known. Yeah, I haven't put up a slide for this, but people recently conducted a whole series of experiments in so-called the non-industrialized societies. Like these are primitive tribes that are living without electricity, without modern day amenities out in Africa and Central America, and found that even in those communities, adults are sleeping 6.5 to 8 hours. So that's considered to be our so-called sleep needs. Um, as I mentioned, a third of the population sleeps less than 7 to 8 hours, and this is both for men and women, and that's a real problem. So here you can see on the left side of this slide that there are a substantial number of both men and women who are getting less than this 7 hours of sleep. There are people on the other hand, and also who are getting more, but this is the part that we are really worried about. Uh, the amount of sleep that we've started obtaining has decreased over the last 2, 3 decades. So, here's both in men and in women. So, men being shown in this red, women being shown in blue. Uh, in different ages, we used to get more sleep back in the 80s. Now, in the 21st century, we are on average getting 30 to 60 minutes less sleep in across all age groups and in both genders. And that's a real problem. Uh, for some reason, again, it's blacks tend to get less sleep as opposed to whites and Hispanics. Uh, Again, is it a cultural thing? Is it the fact that more blacks do shift work? More have long commute times. Again, that's another separate area. But in general, African Americans are getting less sleep opposed to other races. This is an interesting fact that we also have a geographical distribution of sleep duration. So, people have looked at this and found whereas, people on the East Coast tend to have less sleep as opposed to people on the West Coast, and and uh, and I guess it is hypothesized that part of the reason is that a late night show, obviously starts at a later time on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. You know, uh, Stephen Colbert or whatever, Trevor Noah or whatever. So the start times are there. So people have looked at bedtimes. So the bedtimes are much later on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast, perhaps because of this reason and maybe that's the reason why we have less sleep or more sleep deprived individuals on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. Now, sleep deprivation can be acute or partial. So, I need 8 hours of sleep. Tonight, I go home. I sleep only 4 hours because I'm out with friends. But I make up for that lost sleep the next day. So there's this so-called the acute sleep deprivation paradigm. But I think the more real, common thing that exists in the society is what we call as chronic partial sleep deprivation. So it's that we have repeated failure to obtain sufficient amount of sleep to recover from the sleep lost during the previous night or the previous 2 nights. David Dinges from UPenn had done, the study 20, 30 years ago, which I still tell patients is that if I lose a certain amount of sleep tonight, I have to make up for that lost sleep in the next 48 hours to fully recover. Now, in real life, what most of us do is we try to recover that sleep on the weekends. So after 3, 4 nights of sleep deprivation, we try to recover on the weekends. And what's been clearly shown that that's never, never, never going to be enough. So we have to do it within the first 24 to 48 hours of losing our sleep. Otherwise, there's going to be this detrimental effect of constantly linearly losing sleep as time goes by. So here's studies done in humans looking at something called a vigilant psychomotor vigilant task, and where we are giving instructions to the subject and saying, hey, do if I say one, click. If I say two, don't click. Odd numbers, even, or whatever we have, and we're looking at how many times are they able to respond to the task in question. And here at baseline, again, where's my arrow? Let me get that onto the screen. Here we are. So here we are, as time goes by, this is an experiment done over a 2-week period. And while the subject is being allowed to get adequate amounts of sleep, uh, they continue performing pretty well. But then during this 2-week period, I allow them only 6 hours of sleep during the night, you can see that the number of lapses go up. And then if I similarly do only 4 hours of sleep at night, the number of lapses go up even more. And of course, if a complete sleep loss, there's going to be just, they give up after the first 2 nights of sleep deprivation. Similarly, you can see the graph for my subjective sleepiness scale score. If I am sleep satiated, I have no problems, feeling good throughout the 2-week period. But then I start really noticing a problem as time goes by. Now, this is interesting. And this is something that I do tell patients that, as you can see over here, that after the first 2 nights of sleep deprivation, of 6 hours of sleep at night, I subjectively feel sleepy. I report feeling sleepy during the daytime, but it plateaus off as my sleep deprivation goes on. And that is a problem because when people are chronic, partially sleep deprived, they stop recognizing that they are sleepy in the daytime compared to normal, healthy individuals who are getting adequate amounts of sleep at night. And that's the reason why they don't come to us. They feel fine, in quotes. Now, when we look at this, sleep duration and its effect on health, one can look at it in many different ways. And one of the ways in which people have looked at associations between sleep duration at baseline and things like all-cause mortality as time goes by, one can see this nice U-shaped curve. So here in the middle, where I'm getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep, I have the lowest hazard ratio for dying on all-cause mortality in both men and women. But if I'm getting less than 7 hours of sleep, that hazard ratio goes up. But what is also surprising is that if I'm getting more sleep, then also the hazard ratio goes. Now, this has remained a real mystery to us that when people are so-called long sleepers, why do they have this issue of having higher mortality compared to people who are sleeping the adequate amount, 7 to 8 hours, or the optimal amounts? People have tried restricting the sleep in these individuals, but they did not have any change in outcomes. Getting more sleep to this individual definitely has a change in the outcomes. And a similar U-shaped curve exists for other outcomes as well. So if one looks at the relationship between sleep duration and, say, prevalence of hypertension, again, a nice U-shaped curve. If I'm sleep deprived or I'm getting too much sleep, my chances of developing hypertension go up. Again, model 1, model 2, model 3 looks at confounding variables. So you eliminate all the other variables that could be causing risk for hypertension, and even after eliminating those variables, the risk for developing hypertension is associated with sleep duration. Similar, body mass index. Optimal sleep allows me to remain thin, but if I have less sleep, I gain weight. If I have more sleep, I gain weight. Similar relationship between development of diabetes and impaired glucose tolerance. So many outcomes have shown this kind of a U-shaped curve. So why is this U-shaped curve prevalent? So I'm going to focus on what could be the reasons why when people are sleep deprived, they develop this risk for developing hypertension and all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease risk. So people have looked at, things like endothelial dysfunction or autonomic balance, which, as most cardiologists will tell us, are the reasons why there is an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So if there's endothelial dysfunction, I'm going to develop a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Autonomic balance, meaning sympathovagal balance. So if the sympathovagal balance is more in the favor of the sympathetic nervous system as opposed to the vagal nervous system, then I'm going to be at a higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease. So if I take two sets of individuals, those who are sleep deprived versus sleep satiated, 7 hours being the cutoff point, and I follow them over a period of time, in this particular case, 15 to 20 years, and I recheck their brachial artery diameter. So the higher the diameter, the worse the outcomes. And I also look at something called flow-mediated dilatation, which is a very common way of looking at something called vasoresponsiveness. So if I occlude the brachial artery and I then, because of ischemia, I should have the ability to dilate my distal vascular beds. And if I release the cuff from a brachial artery, I want to see how much I dilate. And if I don't dilate, that's a problem. So the flow-mediated dilatation decreases with sleep deprivation, and the brachial artery diameter increases with sleep deprivation, both being bad things for cardiovascular outcomes and suggesting endothelial dysfunction. Similarly, if I look at something called the vaso or sympathovagal balance, so we use something called heart rate variability to measure that. And what we look at, heart rate variability in the frequency domain. And if I am predominantly in the low frequency domain, that's a bad thing. If I'm in the high frequency domain, that's a good thing. So here you can see that with sleep deprivation, so here's a control set of individuals who are getting good, adequate amounts of sleep versus those who are sleep deprived, getting less than 7 hours of sleep. And the low frequency domain goes up as a percentage with sleep deprivation, and high frequency percentage goes down with sleep deprivation. So the LF to HF ratio goes up, which is a bad thing, suggesting that my sympathovagal balance has changed. Similarly, I can also look at vasoresponsiveness in response to acetylcholine. If I inject acetylcholine, my vasculature should dilate, and which is a good healthy thing. And with sleep deprivation, my ability to dilate the vessels in response to the ACH goes down, which is again a bad thing. The other thing that we've recognized as an association with sleep deprivation is the risk for obesity. In fact, there was an editorial several years ago calling it the tale of two epidemics in the United States, that as we have become a more sleep deprived society, we have also become a more obese society, and perhaps the two things are linked. And as the association between sleep deprivation and obesity, just because by being awake we have an increased opportunity to eat, are we just more tired and therefore we have reduced energy expenditure? Is there an alteration in the thermoregulation causing less energy expenditure? Or are we just more hungry? And so we have focused on this thing about increased hunger, because we've recognized even amongst ourselves that when we are fatigued, we reach out for bad food. So we want that sugar rush. We use eating as an antidote to fatigue and sleepiness. And we know that things like leptin and ghrelin are controlling our satiety and hunger. And so people have looked at the association between sleep deprivation and leptin levels and renin levels. And this was data from University of Chicago. Karen Spiegel, Eva Van Cotter, from many, many, many years ago, looked at, if I'm sleep deprived, my leptin levels are going to be lower and my renin levels are going to be higher. And leptin, being a hormone of satiety, tells my brain that I don't need to eat, but if my leptin levels are going to be low, I'm going to constantly feel hungry. And renin is something that stimulates the appetite. So if my renin levels are high, I am going to subjectively feel more hungry. And so they show this clearly that in that same individual, my ratings of hunger were higher if I was sleep deprived, and ratings of overall appetite were higher if I was sleep deprived. The other thing is to look at the association between sleep deprivation and glucose intolerance. One can look at this in acute sleep deprivation, and one can also look at it at a population level and see if there's an association with chronic sleep deprivation. So this was an experiment done in otherwise absolutely healthy young individuals who had no sleep complaints, who had no metabolic complaints. They had normal blood work at baseline. They were 18 to 27 years of age, and they were put through the sleep restriction paradigm where at baseline they slept their 8 hours per night. And then for the next 6 nights, they were sleep deprived and were made to get only 4 hours of sleep at night. And then they were allowed to recover from that sleep deprivation by being allowed to sleep 8 to 12 hours for the next 6 nights. And then they looked at what happened to my glucose tolerance, my insulin clearance at each point in time. And what was shown was that if I, during the time when I'm sleep deprived, my ability to clear the glucose after intravenous glucose or after breakfast is much lower as opposed to people who are sleep satiated or during sleep recovery. And the idea is that if I eat something or I'm given a glucose load and I don't clear it, my tissues are going to be exposed to that glucose level for longer periods of time, which is a bad thing. Same thing, my insulin response is going to be is going to be lower to that same glucose load, and which is again a bad thing because insulin should it helps clear the glucose from the blood, and if my insulin levels are going to be lower because I'm sleep deprived, that's not a good thing. So the idea really behind this acute sleep deprivation model was that even otherwise healthy individuals, if sleep deprived for 5 nights or 6 nights, become diabetic essentially. Of course, luckily they recovered back to their baseline after being given the opportunity to sleep ad lib. Now, in the same individuals, they also looked at, obviously levels of sleepiness, sympathovagal balance, and evening cortisol, and found that, not surprisingly, that their levels of sleepiness were much higher. Like I mentioned, the sympathovagal balance shifted towards the sympathetic system because of sleep deprivation, and evening cortisol was higher. So that's a bad thing because cortisol normally is the highest when we first wake up in the morning. The way I teach is that waking up is stressful. That's when I get my cortisol up. It should not be high in the evenings, but in these people, it is high in the evenings, which is not a healthy thing. Again, that's an acute sleep deprivation model. That's not real life. The real life model is chronic sleep deprivation because that's what most of us suffer from, where we never give ourselves the chance to recover from our sleep debt. So this was a nurses' health study that had been conducted back in the 70s and 80s. So they started the study in the 70s looking at the nurses and their outcomes on things like cardiovascular health. They were not really collecting numbers about sleep at that time. And I think sleep became more fashionable in the late 80s, early 90s. And so they started collecting sleep related data only in the 1980s and looked at sleep duration as one variable. And they followed these, in their pool, they had about 70,000 nurses from which they had the data regarding sleep. And they followed these women for a decade and looked at incident diabetes or glucose intolerance that developed over time. And what what they found was over a 10-year follow-up period, if I looked at the correlation between or association between baseline sleep deprivation and the risk for developing total diabetes and symptomatic diabetes, the odds for developing those two conditions was higher if I was sleep deprived, if I was getting less than 7 hours of sleep, or again, more than 8 hours of sleep. So again, the magic number for how much sleep we need seems to hang around this 7 to 8 hour mark. So I'm going to end my talk by saying, with poor sleep health, is this the kind of future that we're going to be looking at? And so my parting thoughts would be, to all of us in the audience, people in general, all the patients who come to the clinic, let's all focus on good sleep health. So let's focus on getting the right amount of sleep, the right timing of sleep. If we have a sleep disorder, whether it be insomnia, apnea, narcolepsy, restless legs, let's take care of those. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was the perfect opening. You really set the scene for people understanding why sleep is so important. And we all recognize it as important. Hopefully all of you now also recognize that sleep is incredibly important for our whole health.